Hi, Year 12. I hope you're all well, and I hope you're ready and in the frame of mind to be thinking about your EPQ projects for the next half an hour or so. Okay, so this session is one that normally would be taught face to face in school, either in the lecture theatre or another space like that. But with it being locked down at present, we're delivering it remotely like this. So this pre-recorded video, and the focus of this is going to be on collecting primary data, which I'm hopeful is going to form a fairly significant portion of your EPQ project. And certainly it will need to if you want to be aiming to get one of those really high marks. So collecting primary data. So to start off with, I want you to think, and I want you to think if you know the difference between primary and secondary data. And you might have encountered these terms elsewhere in the school, potentially in some science lessons, potentially in some social sciences, maybe psychology or sociology may have referred to these terms. And also, is one type of data better than the other, and why? So just pause for thought for a moment, and we will move on to discussing the answers to those. Okay, so primary data or primary research is new and original research that no one has done before. Okay, it usually has a specific purpose, so it's there to fix a specific problem or answer a specific question. And in the context of your EPQ project, primary research is research which is carried out by you. Okay, so some form of questionnaire or survey or interview along whatever theme it is that your research project is about. Now, it has to be stated, it says new and original that no one's done before. Well, you might be thinking, well, my project isn't brand new. Other people will have researched into it before, which is true. So there may be other data out there, but no one will have asked the exact questions to the exact people that you have. You'll have got different samples, or you'll have phrased them in a different way, or you'll have structured your research in a different way. So when we say new and original, it doesn't mean it has to be an absolute brand new concept which no one has ever thought of before, but it just means it's carried out specifically for your project. Whereas secondary research or secondary data is research that has been done by someone else already, okay? And it's highly likely that you've already been carrying out research into secondary data. So you've already decided on the general theme or general question for your EPQ project, and you'll have likely been reading some articles, some TED Talks and YouTube clips. You've been finding out some information about your project, and a lot of that information will have been researched by someone else. So lots of the reading you've done already will be secondary research. Okay. So the question about is one form of research, is one set of data better than the other? Well, the short answer is there isn't an answer to that. They both have their pros and cons. Okay. So primary research gives you an in-depth insight into whatever it is that you're researching. Certainly in terms of your EPQ, it demonstrates to the moderator and the person who's marking your project that you're highly engaged in your project. You know, you've not kind of just left other people to do the work and you're taking their findings. You really invested time and effort into this. You know how accurate the data is that you've obtained, and you know how much integrity it's got. So let me give you an example. Let's say you did a questionnaire all about global warming, and you decided to hand out that questionnaire in the cafeteria at Greenpeace, their headquarters down in London. Well, that's going to have quite a bit of bias, because by the very nature of the people that work at Greenpeace, you're going to have a lot of people who are dead against global warming and want to make some radical changes to prevent it from happening. Okay. So if you were to use other people's research, you don't know how biased or equally representative it is. Whereas if it's research that you've carried out, you're going to know a lot more about how much integrity that data has got. And that links to the second point. You can make an informed judgment about the bias. So it might be a bit more subtle than the example I gave before. It might be that the survey or the questionnaire that you choose is distributed amongst students at Urmston Grammar School. Well, That's all very well, and there's lots of different ages, lots of different genders, lots of different socioeconomic backgrounds, but we all have one thing in common, is that you all go to Urmston Grammar School, and that by its very nature is a relatively limited representation of society. So even though there might be some breadth within your survey sample, there might also be, you know, some areas where it's not quite as representative, but you can judge that for yourself. One of the key things which is really good about primary research is you can design it specifically for what you want. Okay, so another example, let's say you're researching into the best materials to make a suspension bridge out of. You could carry out some sort of investigations, some experiments to find out whether steel or iron or copper or an alloy or wood or whatever else is the best material to make a bridge out of. And you might look at some other research papers where one scientist researched to find out what the best material was to make a car from. So even though that's going to have a similar theme, you're looking at the strength and the malleability and how rigid and the breaking point and all that sort of thing, even though there's going to be some similarities, they were still investigating into a whole different theme compared to yours. So whenever you're doing primary research, you know that you can amend it or sort of adapt your research so it exactly suits what you need. Disadvantages of primary research, it's time consuming. You've got to do it yourself, whereas a lot of secondary research has already been done. You just need to look it up. It is surprisingly complex to get really good quality data, even from a relatively simple thing like a survey or a questionnaire. Really just takes some thought and time. In terms of your EPQ, it's going to be relatively limited in scope. You know, you are one student partway through your A-levels. You're not going to be able to conduct a survey which is distributed to 10,000 people across 5 different continents, okay? Or you're not going to be able to interview 100 people, 50 of whom have had their COVID jab and 50 of whom have not had their COVID jab yet. You're going to be quite limited. You are only a limited resource yourself. You have to consider the ethical implications. Let's say you wanted to research into something quite sensitive, okay? You're looking into abortion or HIV or something which is really quite edgy and quite sensitive. There need to be some considerations about what you're asking of other people if you're carrying out that primary research. And ethical research methods are something that you'll have another EPQ session on in due course. You need to consider how representative it is, and I've already sort of alluded to that. Have you got a really broad representative sample, or is it actually quite narrow, and is it going to give you quite a limited view? And the other limitation to your own primary research is it's probably not going to be peer reviewed. Lots of kind of official research done by universities and research institutions will have been carried out, and then another expert in the field will have sort of reviewed and analyzed it and kind of given the seal of approval to say, yeah, I agree with the findings of this. And once things peer reviewed, that adds a lot more weight to how useful that information is. It's highly unlikely that your research is going to be peer reviewed. Secondary research advantages, there's loads available. The internet is a wonderful thing, and lots of it is out there on the internet, but you've got hopefully access to online journals, online libraries, all that sort of thing. Secondary research does tend to be carried out by experts in their field. So if you're looking into, you know, new and novel ways of treating cancer, lots of the secondary research out there will have been carried out by, you know, world leading scientists and experts in that field, okay? Secondary research is often peer reviewed, which I've just mentioned is a big advantage. And often it saves lots of time as well, okay? But disadvantages, is it specific enough? You know, it might be similar to the question or the problem that you're investigating into. Is it exactly the same, or is it just kind of close to? Like I mentioned before, can you guarantee that it's impartial or void of bias? It depends how much information they provide you with that secondary research, how many people were in the survey, the distribution of ages and genders and all that sort of thing. You may not know that as well. And also, is it from a trusted source? And let's be very clear on this, just because something is on the internet, it doesn't mean it's a fact. Okay, Donald Trump termed the phrase alternative facts, which often tends to mean it's something that one person believes, but isn't necessarily true. Okay, so just be wary when you're using secondary research methods or kind of gaining secondary data that you believe it's come from a trusted source, ideally a peer-reviewed journal article. But to answer the question about which is the best, really, in order to have a quality EPQ project, you need to have both. You need to have some quality primary research that you carried out yourself, and then a range of secondary research from journal articles and other bits and pieces that you're going to incorporate into your project. Okay, and ultimately, good primary research leads to high marks in your EPQ. Okay, AO2, use of resources, that's one of the sort of marking criteria. To be in that high marking band, you need to show evidence of detailed research involving the selection and evaluation of a wide range of relevant resources. Without saying it in so many words, you need to do your own research. You can't just rely on, oh, I've read this book, oh, I've read that, oh, I found that on the internet. You need to do some of the fact collecting yourself. Okay, and in terms of the breakdown of what your EPQ reports are going to be looking like, you'll start off with an abstract and introduction, sort of outlining what you've looked into and the general themes of your project. You may include a literature review, linking onto a lot of the journal articles and wider reading that you've done. But then when you go into the methodology, which is essentially a discussion of what research you're going to do and what you're going to find out, what results you've obtained, a discussion of the results and the conclusions that you've drawn, that is all going to link very closely to the primary research that you've carried out. Okay, so this really needs to be quite a big part of your project. Okay, so what are the different types of primary research you can do, and what sort of primary research should you do in your project? Because different projects are going to suit different forms of primary research. Okay, so the first two main ones, which I've mentioned a couple of times already, are questionnaires and interviews. Okay, so you're trying to find out all about people's perceptions of Brexit. Why did the Brexit referendum result in a vote to leave? Or why did, talk about Donald Trump again, why was Donald Trump beaten by Joe Biden in the 2020 US election? Okay, so that sort of thing, you can carry out interviews and surveys with people, and you could interview individuals or focus groups to find out people's perceptions of those. Be very aware, though, that questionnaires and interviews aren't going to lead you to facts. They're going to lead you to people's opinions, which are very subjective. Okay, so if you ask the interview question, which of these 5 treatments do you believe is the most effective at treating Alzheimer's, then, even though 90% of people might say, oh, this one is the best, or 10% will say that one is the best, it doesn't actually mean it's the best. It means they think it's the best. Okay, so it's quite subjective data you get from that. A focus group is essentially an interview, but to a group of people. Field notes, videos, recording. So this is a bit like doing field work, going and sort of getting out there and seeing information, seeing articles or objects for yourselves. Case studies, which is quite an in-depth analysis of a certain place or article or situation. And being a science teacher, I quite like the idea of collecting some data yourself, where you actually carry out some as detailed as possible scientific investigations. And we've had examples in the past where students have made an article as their EPQ project. So someone's made a prosthetic limb before, or someone's made an app on a phone. And so actually carrying out some scientific actual, investigative work to work out what's the best material, what's the strongest this, what's the best way of doing that, is some really good primary research as well. Okay, so who should you now, it has to be said that the majority of this talk is now going to focus on questionnaires and interviews, because the vast majority of you will incorporate at least one, if not both of those, into your EPQ project. Okay, so who should you carry out that research on? It would be great if you can ask an expert. Okay, so if your research project is all about how effective hydrogen fuel cells are as an alternative to fossil fuels, it would be great if you can track down a university lecturer that is researching all into that area, and they're happy to spend half an hour with you on Zoom having a one-to-one interview or something like that. That would be great. Groups of friends is always going to be a good option, okay? Largely because if they're friends, they're likely to cooperate and help with your research, but also local people as well. So there's different ways of getting other people involved in your research. And again, exactly who you get involved, that part of that consideration should be determined by what project you're doing. If you're looking into something which is more of a social science about human behaviors or sort of history or politics, that sort of thing, you might want to get quite a broad sample of people from different spectrums of society. If you're researching into something quite technical and quite scientific, it's probably no point in getting the perceptions of people from the general public, because if it's really specific, they may not know enough about it to have an informed opinion. So you might need to narrow it down to people that have already demonstrated a particular competence or level of understanding. Okay, so you want to think about the reliability of these different people. Again, let me give you an example. String theory in physics. Okay, it's a really, really complicated bit of physics. If I carried out a survey amongst the year 7 students in school about string theory, the results are going to be pretty meaningless, because year 7 students don't know anything about string theory. Very few people understand string theory. So you want to consider the reliability of the different people. And I'm going to be writing this phrase quite a lot in this presentation: put it in your production log. So when you're thinking about how to conduct your primary research, jot down your thought process, okay, or include a part in your thought process. I've decided to carry out my survey on this number of people from this background or from these places because I think that will give me good data for this reason. Okay, or I have decided to interview these 3 people because they all have contrasting opinions based on the same theme. Okay, so it's important that your production log has a lot of sort of detailed notes in here about how you've decided to go about your primary research. Okay, consider the ethics. Like I mentioned, have you sought their permission? Do they know what the information they're providing is going to be used for? Do they know that you're not going to pass it on to any third parties? And again, ethical considerations are going to be covered in another EPQ session in due course. So we just mentioned about primary research options, things like surveys and interviews and focus groups. Often you want to use multiple formats, because again, let's say I just conduct a survey and the sample that I use for my survey isn't overly representative. Okay, and again, I'll give quite an extreme example. Let's say we are investigating how well have the Conservative government managed the COVID-19 pandemic, and you go to a Conservative club and ask their members, then actually you're probably going to get quite a one-sided opinion. Whereas actually, if you use lots of methods, so if you use a focus group with one sample of people, if you interview some other individuals and then you carry a survey over a broader number of people, we call that triangulation. And basically it means that if any one of those formats of research has some bias in it, incorporating the results with other findings from other formats of primary research is going to reduce the effect of that bias. Okay. You also might want to consider what the best order to conduct these in is, okay? Is it best to conduct an interview with an expert first? Because actually it might be that when you speak to the expert, you actually find out a load of the really good questions that would be useful to ask in a survey. Whereas if you ask the survey first, you might get the results and think, oh yeah, there was a load of stuff actually that I've now found out I should have really asked. Okay, so I'm not saying there's a right or wrong order, but consider the order rather than just blindly doing one then doing the next. And again, write it in your production log. I've chosen to carry out an interview with so-and-so and so-and-so first. From that interview, I've then gained enough understanding and knowledge to be able to put together a highly effective survey, which will then be sent out to 100 people. Okay, so just think about how you're going to do it. Okay. hopefully our primary research will be supported by our secondary data. Okay, so the secondary articles or secondary findings that you've got from journals or online or wherever, again, triangulation means that all the information hopefully builds together to form a clear picture. Now, we've got to be realistic. It may not be. Some of you are probably asking quite complex questions in your EPQ project, and it might be that the view of one group of people is different to the view in another article that you've read, and it's different to another one. And it might be a case if you had to make an overall judgment of which of those views do you think overall answers that question. But again, the more sources that you use, the more thorough and well thought through your project will be. Okay. So yes, you should conduct your primary research. It shows evidence of independent learning. It shows you really engaging with your project, and it shows you going the extra mile as well. And that can mean in the literal sense. I've marked an EPQ project a number of years ago, and the student in question, they weren't answering a question. They set themselves a project of making a tourist, like a tour guide booklet for people visiting Paris. Okay. And as part of their primary research, they actually went to Paris and went to a number of the sites and the restaurants and the places that she was writing in her kind of booklet recommending. And it was first-hand experience. It was primary research. Secondary research would be going on TripAdvisor and finding out where's good to go in Paris. Okay, so that's the sort of, there's an endless number of opportunities to conduct primary research, many of which will be quite specific to your project. Okay, so we're going to quickly talk about some of the different ways you can actually conduct this research. So the first one is surveys. Okay, now you can collect an awful lot of data through surveys, and there's different types of data. You can get quantitative data, which is essentially numbers. So often it's quicker and easier to analyze. It uses lots of tick boxes or scales, but usually it's very closed questions. So it might be on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you agree with this statement? 1 is completely disagree, 5 is strongly agree, and it's like a sliding scale between them. Okay. Or it could be multiple choice where there's a limited number of answers to be able to select from. Qualitative data is where you ask quite an open-ended question, okay? Now, it can provide more meaningful, you can get richer data from it, but it's a lot trickier to collate. With quantitative data, you're usually quite able after a survey to be able to say, right, 80% of our respondents said this, 10% said that, and the remaining 10% said something else, okay? Whereas qualitative data, if you ask 100 people, you might get 100 different answers if it's just an empty box ready for them to write their response in. Okay, but it will be a more detailed answer. Again, when you're considering what sort of questions to ask and what sort of data to collect, put it in your production log. Make sure you show that it's a conscious decision. Okay, consider your response rate and open versus closed questions. Again, response rates are, it's worth including. I sent this survey out to 500 people and I got 50 responses. So that's a 10% response rate, okay? Or I sent the survey out to 20 people and I got 19 responses. That's a 95% response rate, which a high response rate is often a good idea or a good thing. Often because it shows it's a representative view. If I've, in the first example I gave, sending it out to 500 people and getting 50 responses, if I'm only getting a 10% response rate, then whatever conclusions I'm drawing from that data don't necessarily show what everyone thinks or the majority of people think, because not the majority haven't even responded to the question. And you might even be likely to get responses from the people that have the strongest views, which might distort your results. Okay, so again, consider the advantages and disadvantages of different approaches and make a conscious decision of what you're going to do, rather than just sort of let it happen and then sort of try and justify it afterwards. Okay, the difference between a survey and a questionnaire is questionnaires tend to ask more quantitative data. So if you're just asking short kind of numerical questions or more tick box or multiple choice ones or one word answers, we'd class that as a questionnaire, okay? And it's most useful if you're using that to test an existing theory or just to gain a sample of people's general thoughts, okay? Whereas surveys have a balance between open and closed questions. So it's more recommended to have surveys because you can get some of those numerical questions in there, which are nice and easy to analyze, but maybe one or two of the more open-ended questions, which give you a bit more information. Okay. Now, this is something which I really think is important. Okay. So let's put you in a scenario. Let's say you send out a survey to 100 people, they fill it in, you get some results, you analyze your results, and then after that you think, oh, you know what? There was a really good question that we didn't put in. Okay. Or now that I've asked all these questions, it's made me realize I should have asked another one at the end saying, can you explain why you said yes to question 4? Or can you explain why you said no to question 5? Okay. And you don't want to be thinking that after the survey's already gone out and everyone's already answered it and you've analyzed the results, because it's too late by then. So a pilot survey is like a trial run of your survey. So you draft a sample survey, a sample questionnaire, send it out to just a few people, a small sample. Often it'll be good to just send it out to a few people in your EPQ class. You spend a small amount of time analyzing that data, and then it enables you to amend your survey to make it as effective as possible. So hopefully from that pilot survey, you realize, oh, actually, I need to rephrase question 5 because I've not made it clear enough. Or it might be question 7 actually doesn't really tell us anything. I can just get rid of it, okay? It can give you an idea of where people might misinterpret questions or where extra questions are needed. And also lots of the online survey tools, they actually tell you how long it took the recipient to complete the survey. So it means you can then honestly say to people next time when you're sending out the real one, this survey should only take you 5 minutes. People aren't going to like it if you say it's only going to take 5 minutes and end up taking them half an hour to fill in. Okay, so it means you can sort of make that judgment call. So carrying out a small pilot survey and then making amendments ready for your real survey is a really good idea. Okay, so pilots involve more open-ended questions, and then often that means you can then narrow down the question in your real survey. Okay, you can then ask more closed questions, and then you can make some links with what's going on in the literature as well. So let me give an example here. I might put this question in my pilot survey, and I think I've already used this example. What aspect of the COVID-19 pandemic do you think have been managed well by the UK government? So it's an open-ended box. People can type away their response in there, okay? And you might get loads of different things, okay? So once you've done that pilot survey and you look at the responses to that, you think, right, I'm going to amend this question now. In the real survey, I'm going to put it like this. I'm going to turn it into a multiple choice question. So what aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic do you think have been managed well by the UK government? Please select all that apply. So is it the lockdown restrictions, eat out to help out, travel restrictions, the vaccine rollout, Nightingale hospitals, or other? And actually then it will be if you were to send this survey out to, I don't know, 50, 100 people, it'll be a lot more straightforward to sort of analyze that data rather than have 100 written responses. Okay. Right, talking about response rates, how many people answer my survey out of the total number asked? So that's an important statistic. You do want to encourage people as best as possible to engage in your survey, because sort of in industry and certainly in like the commercial industry, there's a general rule of thumb that you need to have a 2/3 response rate for the findings of your survey to be meaningful. Okay, if a company is doing an employee satisfaction survey and only, I don't know, 40% of employees actually complete it, it's fairly well sort of understood that actually, well, whatever the findings show us, we're not going to act on them because it's not a significant enough proportion of our employees that we're basing this these findings from. Okay, so you want to have a good response rate. So that comes from your persuasive nature, from your using your persuasion and glowing personalities to kind of encourage people to complete these surveys. So that's one of the challenges of completing primary research like this. Consider how many males or females respond, or does it matter? It may not in some cases. Consider the age of the people who are responding. Have you got a spread of ages, or is your project something really specific to a narrow age group that you just want to focus on? So like I said, if you have too small a survey, you run the risk of a volunteer bias. Let's say you only get 5 people to complete a survey and they all have really quite strong views all in the same direction, then actually the findings are going to suggest something quite significant when actually it's not really based on a big enough sample size. And to give you another example of this, often if you see adverts on telly for like a new product, a new shampoo or conditioner or a new moisturizer or something like that, it might say something like 80% of women found that their skin looked younger after 1 week of using this face cream, whatever. And there will be in the small print at the bottom of the page, the statistics. It will say, this is based on a survey of 800 women or something like that. So the size of your sample is quite an important indicator in how useful the information is. Okay. So if you only ask people who you know, that is known as convenience sampling, and this is the least desirable, okay? And it means that you may not be able to generalize your findings. And I'm going to use Brexit as an example to explain this one as well. I, like many people in the UK, I'm on a couple of different forms of social media. And before the Brexit vote, however many years ago it was, there was lots of posts, lots of memes, lots of news articles about how the Brexit vote was going to go, whether we were going to leave, whether we were going to remain. And right up to the day of the vote, I was really quite convinced that the whole of the UK would be voting to remain, because every person that I knew, every person that, I was friends with on Facebook, every person that, I had an interest in seemed to be thinking the same way that I was thinking. And actually, when the vote happened and it actually turned out that we were voting to leave, it made me realize, the people I associate with, my peer group, my friendship group, the people that I follow or I'm friends with on social media, we all share similar views. And it hadn't made me realize that just because I see it on social media doesn't mean that that is a balanced view of society. Okay, so convenience sampling isn't good for primary research because you're not necessarily going to get a broad and balanced view. Okay, surveys and questionnaires. So there's a few different ways to do them. They're quite fast to obtain. You can use SurveyMonkey. There's Google Forms, and you can have all sorts of settings on them so that you can make them completely anonymous, or you might want them so that you can actually link the specific answers to specific people. And again, I'm not saying there's a right or wrong way to do it, but these are all important considerations. So when you decide how you're going to run your survey, who you're going to ask to fill it in, all that sort of thing, again, make sure that you note down in your production log your thought process in that respect. Okay, a few other bits about surveys. You can use what are called Likert scales. So this is where, a bit like I mentioned, how interested are you, how satisfied, how happy. So, it kind of simplifies the answer. Here's a statement, how much do you agree with it? Or here's a scenario, how often do you do it? Almost always, sometimes, once in a while, rarely, never. So these sliding scales do have some uses. And actually, some of them don't even have to have words. You can have emojis, smiley faces. How pleased are you with such and such? And you can have the big smiley emoji at one end, the kind of neutral, no smile emoji in the middle, and the unhappy emoji at the other side. Those sort of surveys could be used for children if you're carrying out some research on very young year groups, like as part of your project. Okay, nice and quick to analyze as well. But it's difficult to get really rich data from the sort of closed questions that you'd use for that, okay? Often you can improve it by, if it's a multiple choice question, you could add an other category. So if the what's your favorite color, if it isn't red, blue, or green, this person has the option to fill in something else, okay? When you're carrying out a survey, you may want to start with some factual questions to make sure that you can link the response to a certain type of person. So age, gender, that sort of thing, but then moved on to more closed questions and then some open questions at the end, okay? But be aware, and I've already highlighted this, that yes, the first few questions were going to be factual based. Yes, this is my age, this is my gender. But as soon as it moves on to the more open questions, it's subjective, okay? You're gaining attitudes and opinions and ideas of people. It doesn't mean it's a fact, okay? Right, you've got a bit of a task at this point then, so I'm not going to pause the video whilst you do it, but on page 60 of your EPQ sort of work booklets, work packs that you've got, page 60, there's a bit of a draft questionnaire, a sample questionnaire, and you need to complete the tasks associated with it, some of which are to do with finding out what's wrong with it, how do you rephrase questions, all that sort of thing. So page 60 in your packs have got that all about. It just gets you thinking about questionnaire skills. Okay. And this is this really is just a point to reflect, really. So let's say this is your EPQ project title. Should the death penalty be brought back for certain crimes? Again, you don't need to write anything down, but just have a think for a moment. What sort of questions might you put in your questionnaire? Okay. From my point of view, it would certainly be worth acting some of those factual questions first of all, to say what's your name, what's your age. You might not name, sorry, what's your age, what's your gender. You might even want to say what's your postcode, or what's the beginning of your postcode, or something like that. Because then actually, as part of your analysis, you could say, well, 90% of people from this geographical area have this view, whereas, you know, only 30% from this other geographical area share the same view. That could be an aspect that you could look into. Okay. In addition to questionnaires and surveys, it would be good if you can conduct some interviews, okay? So these largely produce qualitative data, so written responses, well, not written responses, word responses on what people think and why. They're not very measurable, but they do tend to be very personal and very detailed. So as an example, one of our current year 13s carried out her EPQ project on, it was to do with the Brexit referendum, and she conducted an interview with the local MP for Urmston and Stretford, Kate Green. And that's, you know, that's a really valuable bit of primary research for her project. Kate Green, an MP, was involved in all the votes around the Brexit referendum and all the build up to it, and now all the aftermath. So it was like a really good, well-informed, insightful person to gain some views on that topic. So interviews, you know, can really add some depth to your project. They are most useful if you can speak to subject experts. They can test an exploratory theory, or if the meaning can be determined by context or circumstances. Okay, so this, again, it might be a good idea to have an interview with someone first to really add some sort of depth and some specifics to your thought process before putting a survey or questionnaire out there, because it might be the result of that interview gives you lots of ideas of what to include in that survey. Okay. Think about the following. Should they be individual face-to-face interviews with just one person? And of course, when we say face-to-face, it probably would have to be through Zoom or through Microsoft Teams or something like that these days. But that might make things easier, actually. You know, if you're researching into something really specific and you know that there's a lecturer at Manchester University who that's their area of specialism, meeting up for a coffee for a face-to-face interview probably isn't doable, but it might be that they're happy to schedule a 20-minute Zoom conversation with you to share their views. Alternatively, a focus group could work well. It's a bit more efficient because essentially you're interviewing a group of people rather than one-to-one, but at the same time, it does diminish the quality of the data, because there's a risk that in a focus group, one person who has a very strong opinion does more of the talking, and other people that may not necessarily agree with them, they might just kind of feel obliged or find it easier just to kind of nod and agree with them. So it might give you a slightly distorted view compared to if you conducted separate interviews with all of them individually. But it still has the potential to be a useful exercise. Okay. So how do you approach an interview? So you want to be asking more open-ended questions that give you lots of qualitative data. So when we say open-ended questions, you don't want to be sort of starting off with an opinion and leading them down a certain line. Oh, the death penalty is really bad, isn't it? Okay, because you're kind of coaxing them to say yes, whereas actually it'll be, tell me about your views on such and such, or what is your experience of this? Quite open questions, so you can really gain a balanced view of what they're saying. They help you get hold of lots of information. You can ask respondents to elaborate on their responses, which is not possible in a survey. So yeah, if you ask a question and then the answer that they give, that might give you an idea of something to ask as a follow-up question. You can sort of direct the interview in a certain direction based on their responses and make it really quite tailored and quite niche. Whereas of course you can't do that in a survey. Okay, again, any thoughts, any plans that you put in place for interviews should go in your production log. Okay, the people or in the focus group or the person you interview may not be a representative sample again. So again, it may not be that the findings are generalizable, especially if it's a one-to-one interview. You can't say everyone in the UK believes such and such when actually you've got that information from just one person's opinion. Okay, so to make it more generalizable, you should interview or carry out focus groups with multiple people if possible, or with a range of people. Okay, there's another task in your workbooks on page 62. So again, it's a little bit of a scenario about some interview skills that goes through some mock questions. Again, I'm not going to go through the instructions for that, but that's a little exercise that you should have a go at doing, because it will make you pause and reflect, and it will, teach you some things to do and some things not to do if planning an interview yourself. Okay, so let's get down to some nitty gritty then. How are you going to use all this in your project, the sequence of events? Okay, so firstly, you need to carry out some background or secondary research along the theme of your project. You are very likely doing that already, or I certainly hope that you're doing that already, researching along the theme that you've decided. Okay, at that point, it's probably worth carrying out a pilot survey to trial to find out what some good questions are. You analyze your trial survey and then make amendments if necessary. You might then implement your actual survey and analyze the results. And then based on the results, you could then plan and implement some interviews. Okay, that is one option. You could do it the other way around. You could do the interviews first and then use the findings of the interview to plan a pilot survey and then put together your full survey. So these are all kind of multiple options. But again, this term triangulation, you're using multiple formats of research. So secondary research, a survey, and an interview, which will hopefully all give you a balanced view in order to answer the question in your EPQ project. Okay. In order to plan, the order you plan to adopt needs to go into your EPQ production log in the planning review, and it needs to be very, very detailed. So don't just say, right, I did a survey, then I got the results, and then I had an interview with so-and-so. You really want to go into the nitty-gritty details, all right? Because again, that's what's going to get you the high marks in your EPQ project. Saying, I emailed person X, it's not great. You really want to go into the detailed evidence. And if you have an appendix in your EPQ project, which you probably should do, then you might want to include things like the transcript of any interviews or the original, like the overall data responses from any surveys or questionnaires. Okay, so like I said, I focused a lot on questionnaires and surveys and interviews, but there's a few other options of primary research. Okay, so we talked about focus groups, and there's a bit of a YouTube video here which you can watch if you wish. Field notes. So an example of this is the sort of things you do on a geography field trip, to measure sand dunes and to, I don't know, do a little survey of water flow rates in different parts of rivers. So it's a bit of hands-on actual investigation. Case studies, so an in-depth analysis of something which has close relation to your project, can be quite time consuming, but might be really useful depending on the specifics of your project. And like I said, the other one I mentioned is doing some hands-on science yourself. If you are doing a science-based project, then it's feasible that you could actually carry out some simple experiments to gain some data yourself. Okay, of course, if your project is something really specific, which is the best malaria treatment, you're probably not going to be able to research that yourself. Okay, you'll have to rely on on secondary research, as well as some questionnaires and interviews. Okay, you're not going to be able to actually carry out an experiment yourself to find out which is the best version. Okay. Yeah, again, just think about the data you're collecting. Quantitative can be tick box and multiple choice. Qualitative, lots of open-ended questions. If you're interviewing someone, if it's face-to-face, you can have a dictaphone, so you're actually recording everything that they say, so you can go back and re-listen to things. If it is on Microsoft Teams or Zoom, you might want to consider recording the conversation. And the benefit of using Microsoft Teams for that is if you record something, you can go into Microsoft Stream afterwards, and it will automatically generate a transcript. It will actually produce a written dialogue of the conversation that went on. So that could be very useful for you. Okay, so at this stage, it's over to you. In your projects at the moment, you've probably been conducting lots of secondary research using journal articles and all that sort of thing, but you need to start thinking how you're going to incorporate some primary research into your EPQ project. And it pretty much goes without saying that if you're going to get a good mark, you have to have some quality primary research in your EPQ, okay? Yeah, so that's that. A few other bits and pieces. Just remember that after February half term, you're going to be booking an appointment to have a bit of a one-to-one with your EPQ supervisor. So it'll be really good if in time for that appointment, you've had some thoughts about what sort of primary research you intend to do, or some initial ideas of how you might conduct your primary research for your project. Now, as a bit of an aside note, I just want to go through one thing on Office 365, which might be useful for you. There's lots of ways of carrying out online surveys these days. I already mentioned SurveyMonkey and Google Docs and Google Forms and that sort of thing. You may not know, but your school email account does actually have one of these kind of, it's called Microsoft Forms, one of these platforms available to you already. And I just want to go through a little bit how it works, because a number of you may choose to use this. So when you log into your emails on Office 365, often you get a page looking like this, and it has this little sort of grid of 9 dots, 9 squares. So that's called the waffle. So if you click on that, it will it'll open up this kind of window of different apps, which all form part of the Office 365 package. So if you open that, you go on Forms. And this means that any forms, any surveys that you do will automatically be saved and linked to your school email address. So there's no worries about losing them or losing track of where you've saved them, all that sort of thing. Okay, so if you want to set up a new form, it opens up here as a drop-down menu. Do not select quiz, because a quiz is where there's a right or wrong answer, and you can say, yes, you got it right, or no, you got it wrong. If you're setting up a survey or a questionnaire, I assume there won't be right or wrong answers, because you'll be collecting people's views and people's opinions on things. So you click on the form bit, okay? That will take you to a page looking like this. You set up the title of your form, you add different questions, and exactly what questions you use, I'm not gonna go into at this stage, okay? But I am gonna highlight up here a few of the settings that you'll want to play around with. So these 3 dots in the top right-hand corner, that will open up this settings menu. And if you click on that, there's lots of things here that you might want to consider when setting up your questionnaire. So often you might want this anyone can respond box. So this one you might want to tick that, because at the moment it says only people in my organization can respond. And that means only people with an Urmston Grammar email address. So you may well want to amend that so that anyone can respond. You can select a start date and an end date. So when the survey will open for people, when it will close for people. You can choose to randomize the questions if you want, because if you feel like if it's a 20-question survey and people start to give up by the end and maybe not consider the questions as well as they did the first few, randomizing and shuffling the questions around might give that a bit of a balanced view. Customized thank you message at the end of the survey. When they click submit, a little thank you message crops up. So if you tick that box there, you can actually personalize that and make that a bit more specific to your research project. And then finally, when you're sharing this project, when you're sharing the survey, if you click share, at the moment, the default will say only people in my organization can respond. But if you go on that drop-down menu, it will change it to anyone can respond. You click copy, and that link there, you can put on an email and send it out to anyone and everyone you know who can complete that survey or questionnaire. Okay, so just be aware that that's all linked with your school email account. So of course, you're welcome to use whatever format you like, but the Microsoft Forms, is quite convenient for this sort of thing. Okay, that is it, I think. I hope that's useful. If you have any questions or anything that you've been wondering about during the course of that we can call it a lecture, others might call it a bit of a ramble, by all means, send me an email and I will happily help out. Okay, other than that, I hope you stay well, I hope you stay safe, and hopefully see you back in school at some point soon. Right, cheerio, bye now.